Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
You know, when things are getting a little weird, it's important to have a bit of variety. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you are in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Voigt, and I'm your host for this podcast where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brains not only about current projects, but state of the business, what got them started, all sorts of fun stuff. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, and we certainly hope that you do, you can do that over at Apple Podcasts, over at Spotify Podcasts, or you can find every single one of our episodes archived over at our YouTube channel. Also, do you feel like following us on social media? I really hope that you do. You can find us on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram, either at In the Seats or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of fun updates. Excuse me. And finally, you can find us over at In the Seats, intheseats.ca, where our hardworking team is cracking away at a myriad of reviews and features on stuff playing festivals, stuff opening video on demand, stuff opening virtual cinema, stuff opening theatrically, whether it's theatrical, and stuff opening on DVD and Blu-ray for you to check out and to figure out what to watch. But on today's episode, this is what we're going to talk about what to watch. We're going to talk about Tales of the Uncanny, the ultimate survey of anthology horror, which is playing Canada-wide for a virtual run courtesy of the Winnipeg Cinematheque up until December 15th. And it's really an interesting deep dive into the history of anthology films, and because horror films and anthology films really seem to go side by side, and it's one of those genres that lends itself to the anthology. And we talked to the producers and co-hosts of the film, as it were, David Gregory and Kier-La Janisse, who are both experts on the subject and filmmakers and researchers and authors and of their own right. And it's one of those, and they go really deep into the history of the anthology film with some fantastic subjects who they talk to. And for anybody with a fascination with not only horror but anthology horror, this is a really fun deep dive. And on top of all that, it's one of the weird things because as they were setting up to shoot this film, they were planning a lot of sit-down interviews and this, that, and the other in sort of the traditional documentary sense. And then COVID hit. So they did most of this film over Zoom. And it's definitely a product of the times, which I kind of loved. But I hope you love our talk with these two. Now, I mean, obviously, congrats on the film. I got a kick out of it because I think at first glance, I was like, oh, it's anthology. Oh, yeah, no one's ever done this before. Oh, shit, that's cool. And I'm starting going through it, and I'm like, oh, there is such a deep history of the anthology and horror across so many different sort of genres. And I'm kind of curious, or formats, I should say. But what was the initial inspiration for you guys to sort of start putting this together?
Well, originally it was something that originally it was going to be a featurette, and David was already working on this before I became involved because it was originally to tie in with the movie The Theater Bazaar. So, David, do you want to talk a bit about that process?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the Theater Bazaar. We're releasing a special edition on Black Friday because the film never really had a proper release because we had issues with the original distributor, and we got the film back, and I wanted to make it something special, being as it was a movie that we produced. And so one of the things I wanted to do was a featurette about the history of anthology horror, because it was something we talked about a lot when we initially brought Theater Bazaar out, the kind of favorites that we had and favorite segments that we all had, because it's a movie with 7 different directors. And but what the featurette started out was just kind of a historical overview with scholars kind of talking about it from the silent era up to today, and have evolved and key examples, stuff like that. But then when COVID happened, Kier-La was already working with me on it. She set up the interviews with Jovanka and Bruce Hallenbeck and Amanda Reyes and a couple of others, the ones that were kind of shot in a proper studio setting, and we still had some gaps in the story, and so we started talking about who we could get, and could we actually do it over Zoom? Would that just look too stupid among the other interviews? But then as we started chatting back and forth about who we could get, we realized, because through both of us and our mutual connections and colleagues and stuff like that, we could probably get quite a good array of people on Zoom.
Yeah.
And the more we put this list together, the more vast and impressive it got. The more we decided to kind of hone it into something else, where it became sort of a poll asking people what their favorite anthology films were and their favorite anthology segments. And what was interesting was that the results were kind of all over the map. So therefore it kind of covered everything from, the beginning at dawn of cinema right up to today.
Yeah, it was really interesting, all the different stuff that people picked, because, David and I both are really interested in being comprehensive, I think, in a lot of the work that we do. And so everything that people said really allowed for that, because people really touched on everything from, many different countries, many different eras. And so it really allowed the film to be a pretty complete view of this history of these films.
And I mean, I think something else that really stood out for me is just like having it via Zoom almost made me feel nostalgic for that sense of film culture that we've really kind of lost these days, obviously due to the current global situation. And I'm kind of curious from both of your perspectives, when you were putting it all together, when did you know that the Zoom thing was actually working? Because I can imagine you were going into trying to do all these Zoom interviews, maybe with a little trepidation.
I think.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Kayla, you go first.
I was just going to say, for me, it was really seeing Mike Capone's first edit, because I wasn't quite sure. I'm not the director. David was the director, right? So I imagine David had a vision for it, but I was having a hard time figuring, like, how are we going to put all these Zoom interviews together with the professionally shot interviews? Like, how are we going to format it so that it kind of works? And then when I saw the first cut that Mike Capone did, I was like, oh my God. I mean, he completely transformed it, So, I mean, and that was him and David working together to create that, So I was more like helping to set up the interviews, but I wasn't like the visionary behind the project. That was David, and him and Mike Capone really transformed it into something cool, I think.
Yeah, but it definitely it evolved as we started doing these interviews, because we would stay in touch over what the results were, basically. So it was actually really interesting as it was coming in. But I think once I got over the hurdle of the fact that we were going to have Zoom interviews in there, it was actually something that I embraced, because of course right now people immediately recognize what a Zoom call looks like.
Right.
So you're actually looking into somebody's home, or where they're kind of stuck at the moment, where this is the way we're all communicating at the moment, and so it immediately down that kind of barrier of officialness when you have somebody into the studio to do an interview. It was much more conversational. And of course, one thing that people always say when they're talking about an anthology or reviewing an anthology is that it's it's a mixed bag, is a term that comes up a lot. And because one segment might be amazing, another is kind of stupid, or whatever it may be. So actually having it all over the place, actually, funnily enough, kind of didn't seem out of place when we were discussing this subject matter. And then of course there's just so much great trailers and poster art and things like all very kind of lurid and reminiscent of comic books and stuff like that. So we really were able to kind of make something that was like a collage or a scrapbook or something like that mentality when you're going into it. So it was, what like Kayla said, when Mike delivered that first cut, I was like, okay, we've actually got something here. We should actually get more people. And we went around with a second round.
It's an anthology film about anthologies almost.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was great because everybody was so excited and it was so spontaneous. Like, as David said, like, because we were contacting people by Zoom and they didn't have to like drive somewhere and deal with traffic or anything like that. We just like call them up and they're just in their office or in their living room or whatever. It just allowed for this really intimate, spontaneous discussion that shows, how passionate so many of these filmmakers and critics and scholars really are about the genre, but also in many cases showcases their own like collections of stuff. You can see all their toys and books and things like that. And so it just feels like such a love letter to the genre.
No, you're absolutely right. And I mean, it definitely takes down the barriers when you're interviewing somebody and it's clearly their bathroom in the background. It sets a different vibe for it, but it's a vibe that kind of works. And I'm just curious because, I mean, especially through watching it, there were so many sort of examples that I had even forgot were anthology movies. Like I always think of something like Black Sabbath as just this, this great Bava piece, but it is an anthology film in and of itself. And when you're doing research, like, can you cut yourself off or do you try to go as deep as humanly possible? Like, I'm always curious where the line is on terms of, is it too much? Is there not enough? Where do you sort of find that balance?
I mean, I personally never stop. It's like, just go as deep as you can,
I think in some cases we there were a couple that we actually had in there, but took them out in later edits because it actually did mess with the flow of the story. Like Wayne Coe, who directed Grim Prairie Tales, he chose The Seven Faces of Dr. Lao, which people don't generally think of as an anthology film, and it kind of stuck out like a sore thumb in the timeline. But it was his legitimate answer and counted in the poll. And then even one of the ones that we've remastered to come out with the Blu-ray, Master of Horror, doesn't actually get mentioned in the film because it was so obscure that nobody mentioned it. But then we found it and we're like, let's remaster this thing and let people see it.
When you're doing, because especially horror seems to be lending itself, and not just horror, maybe pop culture in general really seems to be lending itself more and more to these sort of behind the scenes deep dives into the specific genres themselves. What is it about the history of horror which is just probably so much richer than perhaps straight drama or comedy or anything else like that?
I'm not sure it's necessarily richer, but it is true that but I think it's more to do with us as fans and collectors and documenters, whatever we have this passion where we want to dig deeper behind the stories, and probably have had it since childhood, getting Fangoria or whatever it may be. There's more you want to know, there's more you want to see, and I often joke when asked about it that in the future there's going to be so much more information about Jess Franco films than there are about Fellini films in terms of actual first-hand recollections of people, which is, I mean, I think it's awesome, but it's probably not the way that, Pauline Kael would have seen it.
Yeah, no, horror fans are sort of notoriously rabid about the genre, about the history. They want to know everything in a way I think that people into comedy aren't or don't think about. I mean, it's obviously there are comedy people who are really into the history of comedy, but I would just say horror fans in general, like across the board, pretty much every horror fan wants to know everything about the movies that they love, And so you can have documentaries that are just about the making of Pet Sematary, or whatever, and those films will find an audience because horror fans just eat that stuff up.
And I think, not necessarily specific to Tales of the Uncanny, but I think, when, in my experience, documenting making of films, the more interesting ones generally are the ones which were done in the trenches with a low budget, with just passion and drive, and often those films are genre pictures. So, when you look at the making of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's a much more interesting making of story than most. So it's so that does help for sure. And
even the one that David made himself, the Richard Stanley documentary about the making of the Island of Dr. Moreau. I mean, that is a film that has really transcended the genre fans. Actually, I get emailed by people constantly that are like people that I would not consider horror fans that are like, I just saw you in this movie, you know. And I'm always surprised. I'm like, wow, these people are finding this movie. And it's just it's like, not only was it like so well received among genre audiences, but it's like the weird story of that movie, you know, that's depicted in that film has totally transcended the genre. And, you know, so it's one of those examples of a making of movie that actually hits all audiences too. But,
and especially when it comes down to horror, it is such a warm community that a lot of people don't necessarily give it credit for. And while watching the film, like you say, it's a love letter. And I mean, you never got the sense of, you know, you had to twist someone's arm to participate, or they were just there for the appearance fee or what have you. It was something people felt genuinely passionate about. And that always feels to me, especially in horror documentaries, that the care is there. And I mean, and that kind of does bleed through, and it's important to the history of the genre as well, to sort of allow that to come through, which maybe doesn't come through in other sort of behind the scenes kind of things.
I think in the case of this one, though, this particular subject, although you don't know until you start talking to people about it, but this particular subject, as we said before, was something that people had a lot of passion for. It's something they'd obviously discussed before. It was something that they'd obviously thought about before, you know, because they had very kind of clear idea of what they wanted to talk about in terms of, you know, a favorite segment or whatever it may be. So now that I look at it, of course, it ended up becoming this feature film that it wasn't intended as originally, but that's because people, you know, had so much to say in a passionate manner.
Yeah, and people just had interesting thoughts about the format itself in terms of, you know, how it functions when you've got a single director doing, you know, multiple episodes versus the sort of newer approach of anthologies, which is often to bring together emerging directors to kind of let them show their stuff. And then in the case of something like Theater Bazaar or Nightmare Cinema, the one that Mick Garris produced recently, you know, it's bringing together, in some cases, veteran directors, you know, that want to have an opportunity to just make something where they can have final cut, you know. And so there's many different reasons why the anthology format will appeal to different people, you know, from audiences to the filmmakers that participate in them. So it's like, it's really a multifunctional genre. And I mentioned, I think even in the press release and definitely in the movie, that the format is very connected to older modes of storytelling that horror fans tend to respond to really well. Like short form horror fiction and campfire stories and all these kind of things are just like a staple of genre fandom as you're growing from being a kid into an adult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea that you brought up of the storyteller telling you a story is something that we, you know, most people grew up with in some form or another. And so, you know, you're in a safe environment, but you're scared, you know, when you're being told a creepy story around the campfire. And that's something that people definitely can relate to across the board. And again, a lot of people saw their choice of anthology favorite was one that they saw at a young age, where it like blew them away, you know.
Well, it is one of those things, because we're really introduced to horror sort of culturally in the short form, and that's not something people necessarily sort of think of immediately. And it's really, I really love how the film really does kind of bring that to the surface, because short form never really tends to get enough respect that it deserves, but it does in the horror genre, which I've always found kind of fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, just like based on you know, like not only books but TV anthology series, you know, that speak to that. And even when you're a kid and you're reading books like The Scary Stories Tell in the Dark or whatever, you know, I mean, short horror stories are they are really important. They're not just looked at as a stepping stone to a novel or a feature, you know, like the short horror story is an art form that is very respected in the horror genre.
Now, I got to imagine, obviously, you'd have done a lot of the groundwork on this before COVID hit and the lockdown, but I'm always also kind of curious, like sort of the process of getting clearances for clips and footage for so many of these movies. I got to imagine it was a bit of a pain while we were on lockdown to finalize some of this stuff.
This is very much something that was made up of trailers and done by fair use, in the same way that a VH1 show would do. Like, as long as you're actually talking about the subject and illustrating what's being talked about, then that is fair use.
No, and that's completely fair. But again, it's one of those questions that I'm always very fascinated by, because it's one of those things that, especially when you're making something like this, you don't necessarily appreciate sort of the legwork that goes into all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and getting decent enough elements of the movies themselves and the posters and all that kind of thing. There was a lot of archival that had to happen in a very short amount of time.
Yeah, but again, that's where horror fans are handy, because horror fans collect that stuff in a way that people interested in other genres don't. You know, so even among the people we interviewed, there's a lot of resources there for all that stuff.
Why do you think the chronicling of not just the history of horror anthology, but just even in pop culture in general, because we get so many subgenres and we get so many divisions down the line that it can be easy to forget some of these things? Why do you think it's important, from both of your perspectives, to have this sort of detailed chronicle of what was?
Of what was in general?
Yeah, in general.
I mean, I know that for horror, a big part, I think, of why there's so much horror analysis and why there's so much horror history, and there's so much scholarship devoted to horror now, is because, it's still such a maligned genre to many mainstream people. I mean, it's like, you'd like to think that we've gone past that, but you still see articles that come out in the paper now about some new horror movie, and it'll be like, finally somebody thinks about politics in a horror movie, or somebody's talking about psychology, and it's just like, every horror movie is talking about politics or psychology.
It's like when they made that Jack Nicholson werewolf movie in the was it in the 90s?
Yeah, it was 92, I think. And
the director was like, we're finally peeling off the story about, like, we're making a story about man's inner uncontrollable beast this time. And it's like, isn't that what it's always been about?
Yeah, so I think for horror fans, part of why they really want to have these histories documented and respected and given scholarly attention and stuff, is because we're still trying to prove to the world that the horror genre is so much richer than mainstream culture thinks it is, so I don't, in terms of like pop culture in general, I think part of the, I think people like to see these, just if you talk about cinephilia in general, movie fans like to know the history of movies, and partially because there's a lot of also games of one-upmanship, I think, among movie fans. They love like talking about their trivia and like being able to come up with some trivia the other person doesn't know. And that's all just built into the nerdiness of being a cinephile, because it's like, especially when you grow up as a movie fan, it often will take you quite a while in your life before you meet other people that are kind of at that level and have that same enthusiasm and passion as you. So you probably go through a big chunk of your life being like the only kid in school that's like that into that topic or whatever. And so your stupid trivia and stuff that you have is like your identity. It's the only thing you have, And so being able to then grow up and be an adult and meet other people and be like, wow, I know how Dick Smith made blood too, just like sharing all of this stuff. There's so much, just people love being able to share those histories and being able to unearth things that people haven't discussed yet or whatever. And in horror, it's just amazing how much of that there still is, like how much documentation and scholarship there is. And yet people are still uncovering new things. People are still, revisiting films they saw before and seeing them in a new light because of the way somebody wrote about them really beautifully or something. And then there's also new generations of fans that are being born, every day. And all of those fans are discovering everything again for the first time, you
Yeah.
know? So it's like, so these histories are also a part of like passing on knowledge to the next generation of horror fans,
For sure.
you know, to maybe give them a step up from what we had to go through feeling like we were on our own, you know?
Yeah.
And so all of this documentation and these stories, and this leads into, this connects to the anthology thing too. It's like the storyteller, you know, sharing the story.
And I mean, in this business, it's so unique because no matter the angle we're coming at it from, we've all come at it as fans first, as cinephiles first. And I'm curious for both of you, can you think back and boil it down to maybe one moment or one movie where the light bulb went off in your head and you went, okay, this is what I got to do. This is my passion. This is my love.
Yeah, King Kong, 1976. I was 4 years. Parents took me to see that, and it was, you know, I became obsessed first with, you know, monsters and dinosaurs, and then, you know, and then it just kind of ballooned from there. But it was very, very early for me, and that was, you know, that if it wasn't the first film I ever went to see, it was certainly the film that made the strongest impression.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the first things I remember in my life is of seeing horror, and it's of seeing Horror Express. And that movie was really influential to me in so many ways as a kid. And then shortly after that, I got the Alice Cooper album, $1 Billion Babies, which has the song I Love the Dead on it, you know, and as a kid, that song was terrifying to me. So I would like dare myself to listen to it, you know, but it was sort of between these two things of like this movie and this record. I realized I just liked horror stuff, you know, and I liked Scooby-Doo and Hardy Boys and anything that kind of got into these dark corners, you know, and my parents really would encourage it by cutting out articles from the paper or circling things in the TV guide that they thought I should pay attention to or whatever. So I was lucky in that way that my parents both liked horror films and would let me watch them and stuff. But yeah, but in terms of it being like something I could do, I mean, it took me a while to realize I could actually do anything as like a career or a job or anything with it, you know, but I definitely knew from like, as soon as I was cognizant in the world, I knew that I was a horror fan.
And you know, I love these stories because I mean, I think for me, it was probably Disney's The Black Hole, because as much as I love sci-fi and I love Star Wars, like I knew this was weird and I appreciated how weird this was. And I wanted to know more about that. And that's really those kind of moments that spark not just fans, but even filmmakers as well. And I mean, I think this, coming back to your film, it's one of those things that allows audiences to appreciate so many of those beautifully weird little moments that are out there in so many of these fantastic anthology films. I just want to thank you both for highlighting it and the time today.
Yeah, no problem.
My pleasure.
All right, thanks.